In the previous section, we talked about using constant dividend growth model to estimate price for a common stock or a preferred stock. The problem is the constant dividend growth model, of course, is based on the assumption that dividends are growing at a constant growth rate. But that assumption sometimes would not work for certain companies. It usually works pretty well for mature companies that have stable growth. But for some other company, for example, for some high growth companies, we cannot use the constant growth model directly because we know that the company cannot sustain the high growth rate forever. So we say these firms may have two stages of growth, and stage one is the high growth rate during the so-called supernormal growth period, and then after that it starts to have a steady growth after the firm matures. So if we think about some, for example, high-tech, biotech kind of companies, so far they demonstrate very high growth rates, but if, for example, the technology is not new anymore or the patent expires, then maybe the company will actually experience slowdown, and then they will have a steady lower growth rate later. So when that happens, we say we can map that two stages of growth in this timeline. And as you see, for example, here in the first 3 years you have a high growth rate, and we call this G1. So that's the high growth rate in the first couple of years. And then later you have the so-called stable growth rate, that's G2, that applies to the later years till forever. So for example, suppose we have a company current has a dividend of $5, and then the company is going to grow at a high rate of 10% for 3 years, and 3 years only. And after that, it will grow at 4%, stable till forever. And the required rate of return is 9%. And then we'll try to use this multiple step approach for the valuation of those high growth or say variable growth company stock. So the first thing we want to do is to calculate the dividends every year. So as you see, I use 10% growth rate to calculate D1. D1 is 10% growth after for $5, so it's $5.50. And then D2 is $5.50 growing by another 10%. And then 1 year later, you have the $6.05 growing by another 10%. And then remember, only 3 years of high growth. After that, as you see, D4 will be only 4% over the D3, so it's 6.92. So should we go on calculate D5, D6, D7? Actually, that would be not necessary. How many dividends should we calculate? Usually we say we calculate dividends for all the years before the growth rate gets stable. So all the first 3 years, and then 1 year after the growth rate gets stable. Remember again, in this example, the growth rate gets stable at year 3, we'll say after year 3. So we calculate the dividend for the first 3 years, and then 1 year after the growth rate gets stable. So we got D1, D2, D3, D4. Then we can apply the constant growth model and calculate the present value of all the dividend in year 4 till forever. So I'll say after year 4. The rationale behind this is, well, remember after year 4 the company is going to have stable growth. So then we can actually apply this constant dividend growth model to calculate the price as of P3. So remember before we mentioned when we use the constant dividend growth model, if you want to calculate P3, you use D4, which is 3 plus 1. Right? So you use D4 divided by I minus G, and we can calculate the price of the stock by the end of year 3, which is 138.42, and this is based on D4 divided by I minus G, I being 9% and the growth rate of 4%. So here you are using the steady lower growth rate later, so the 4%. You're not going to use 10% high growth rate here. So this is the price at the end of year 3. So then you can actually imagine the scenario that you are going to buy the stock today. So that's why you need to find out the price today. And then you're going to hold the stock for 3 years, and then you're going to sell the stock at the end of year 3. So what do we get in these 3 years? We get 1, 2, 3, 3 dividends. So 5.5, 6.05, and 6.655 each every year for the next 3 years. And then we're going to also get 138.42, which is from here. And that is the price of the stock. So this is when you sell the stock by the end of year 3. So then you want to calculate the present value of these cash flows and sum them up. And if you think about it, this is kind of similar to what we did here, right? In this calculation we did for 2 years, but in our calculation here we are doing it for 3 years. Again, imagine that you are gonna buy the stock now, hold it for 3 years, and then sell it at the end of year 3. And then, of course, you are not going to include D4, D5, D6 in this calculation, because by the end of year 3, you sell the stock, and the price, 138.42, is already based on D4, D5, D6, D7, D4 ever, and you're not going to include them again. So you calculate the present value of each every one. So the 550 discount for 1 year, 6.05 discounted for 2 years, and then 6.655 and the last sale price together, they're going to be discounted for 3 years. And then you sum up, you get 122.17. So this is a 3-step approach, or say a multiple-step approach to calculate the stock price P0, today's price, for a company stock that has supernormal growth, or say variable growth. Again, growth rate can change, but if we just try to capture the change in the growth rate, we can try to calculate the stock price following the steps we just described here. You may want to click on these links here and watch the video, watch for the video demonstration working on example 8.3. This is pretty much very similar to what I just described. So check it out. Also, in addition to the present value calculations we just talked about, we can sometimes we also use a so-called PE model, or say a relative value approach to estimate the stock price. So PE ratio is from chapter 2, which is basically price divided by EPS, earnings per share for a stock. If we want to find out the price of the stock in say 3 years, then we use the PE ratio of the stock multiplied by the current EPS, and the current EPS is going to actually grow by the growth rate of G for 3 years. So what you have here, this is actually the expected EPS in say 3 years. So you're going to use the future EPS multiplied by the PE to get an estimate of the future price, future stock price. And of course, if n is 0, if you are looking at today, then you are basically using PE multiplied by E to get the PE today, right? So this formula works also for the future years, future stock prices. When you look at 1 year later, 2 years later, or 5 years later, also the PE ratio may change. So if you are looking at a high growth company, the PE ratio may be high, but then maybe a couple of years later, the PE ratio may be a little bit lower. So you can use a different PE ratio multiplied by the EPS you estimate for the future to calculate the future stock price. As you see, this approach is actually pretty straightforward, based on the idea of relative value, or say the value of the stock relative to its earning per share. So example here, if you are looking at a company's PE ratio, it's 12.98. The company earned 5.05 per share, so that's the current EPS, E0, and it's going to grow at 12.8%. So you're going to just use the PE ratio 12.98 multiplied by the current EPS, and then multiply by 1 plus G at the power 5. So this part together here, this is to calculate the future EPS in 5 years, multiplied by the PE to get the future price in 5 years. You can also look at example. This is question number 35 at the end of chapter 8. So if you see the EPS 2.5 and DPS, which is dividend per share, 1.3, and here it says both EPS and DPS are expected to grow at 80%, and the company's current PE ratio of 22 seems a little bit high, and it's expected to fall to 18 within 5 years. So calculate the value of the stock by first estimating the dividend over next 5 years and then the stock price in 5 years. You're going to use a 10% required rate of return here. So what we do, if we know the dividends are going to grow at 8% each every year, then you can calculate D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5. And then P5 is the PE ratio in 5 years multiplied by the EPS in 5 years. So EPS in 5 years is this, and PE ratio in 5 years is not 20 but 18. So it's 66.12. That is the price in 5 years. Now, if we want to know the price today, what you want to do is imagine that you're gonna buy the stock today and sell the stock in 5 years. So in 5 years, you're gonna get D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5, and then you're gonna sell it in 5 years. And when you sell it, you estimate that you're gonna sell it at this price, 66.12. So again, same idea. Calculate the present values, sum them up one by one, and the result is 47.21. You may also try to use your financial calculator. Use the MPV functions in your financial calculator to enter the numbers. This is your first cash flow, this is your second cash flow, third cash flow, fourth cash flow, and these two together, that will be your cash flow in the 5th year. Enter into your calculator, input 10% as the discount rate, and calculate the MPV. You should get $47.21. So try with your financial calculator too, and you can of course also try to use this formula and get the results manually. What is the difference between the examples in the last slide and the examples in slide number 30? Slide number 30 here is the so-called variable growth technique. In the last slides, P5 is estimated by the PE model, while in slide number 30, under the so-called variable growth rate, P3 is estimated by the constant dividend growth model. After you calculate the terminal value, either P5 in the last slides or the P3 under the constant dividend growth model, either way you were trying to get the terminal value. After you get the terminal value, you follow the same approach in both examples to calculate P0, which is to calculate the total present value of the dividends and the terminal value. So again, in this case, P5 is the so-called terminal value, or say the value of the stock at the end of year 5 of this investment horizon. And in page 30 and 31, the P3 is also called the terminal value, or say the final price of the stock at the end of the investment horizon in that example. So bottom line is, under both approaches, eventually you are going to try to calculate the total present value of your future cash flows. The future cash flows include dividends of a couple of years and a final sale price. You can use different approach to calculate the final sale price. You can use the PE model, you can use the constant dividend growth model. Once you get the final sale price, or say the terminal value, you try to get the total present value of all the future dividends plus the present value of that terminal value, and sum up.